Welcome to Formed, where each week we navigate a relevant topic or question through honest conversations. We are three pastors with three different backgrounds on staff together at Irving Bible Church in Irving, Texas. We believe we are constantly being formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world, and we hope this podcast helps with that. So let's jump into this week's episode of Formed. Welcome back to another week of Formed, and today is Tuesday after Labor Day. Did y'all do anything fun on Labor Day?
I mean, fun. It was relaxing. I'm not sure I'd say fun.
So I did some labor on Labor Day. I spent some time working, but then in the afternoon I took my daughter to Meow Wolf, and we had a good time. It was a ton of fun. So
wait, what is that?
So it's this sort of trippy, immersive art experience. They have a new one that's here at Grapevine Mills Mall. We had gone a couple years back to the one that's out in Santa Fe, and it's just this crazy, it's hard to describe, but it's just this sort of immersive art experience. And there's a mystery as part of it, and it was a ton of fun. It's a little on the pricey side, but we had a great time.
Very cutting edge going to these places.
Right.
Now.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a lot more questions, but it's probably for after the podcast.
Today's Form Podcast brought to you by Meow Wolf.
Meow Wolf. We record this on Tuesdays, obviously. The show comes out on Thursday. But today's episode is going to be about, I'm going to set you up, Barry. Get ready. A Rihanna song that's called
Umbrella.
Come on.
Work.
Oh, okay. All right.
Do you know how that song goes?
Did I get Umbrella right? I mean, I know that's not the right answer, but she sang Umbrella.
Yes, she did.
Okay.
Yeah.
At least I got one Rihanna song in my. Yeah.
That is
Do you
true.
know how that Work song goes? Can you sing the first part?
No.
Sissy?
Well, the chorus is first of all, that's kind of old.
Yeah.
But it's work, 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 work.
Yes. Yes. That's.
But I like that he went with Umbrella.
This was the one thing I could pull from my memory bank. Sorry.
But can you sing Umbrella?
No. I could, but not on the podcast. Okay. Lose all credibility.
Okay, so I was scrolling.
That I might have left.
I was scrolling on social media on Labor Day, and I came across a Rich Velotis social media post about the theology of work and how he's like, hey, now's the time to rethink your theology of work. And I'm like, well, I can't rethink it if I've never really thought about it in the first place. I threw out the idea to you guys, and you both seemed excited about it, even before you hit record. So I guess, why is it important for us to think about our theology of work?
Yeah, so this is actually something that's really foundational, I think, for us in understanding the story of the Bible. And yet, in so many respects, we sort of miss it, right? Oftentimes, we think of work just based on our experience, oftentimes around sort of, drudgery, just the way in which work sort of sucks the life out of us sometimes, right? And there can be a sense in which that is our experience in work. And yet, when we look at the Bible, we actually see that God is the creator who works in his act of creation, and he forms us as his image bearers. And part of what it means to bear the image of God is actually directly connected to our work in the world. So if you go back to Genesis, this sort of primal story of what it means to be human, and you read those opening chapters, you actually see in Genesis chapter 2, when God forms the first humans, right? This picture of putting them in the garden to work it and to take care of it. But if you see the language that's used to describe what I would call the human job description in Genesis chapter 1, right? God makes human beings in his image. In the image of God, he created them. So this word image, tselem, is the sort of the heading at the top of the job description. What is the human job? To image God, tselem. And it's the word that would actually have been used in the ancient world for a statue that they would install Israel's neighbors when they worshipped their idols. They would create an image, a tselem, and put it in the center of the temple. Well, God creates human beings in his image to rule on his behalf, to represent him. So the job title is tselem, to image God. And then he tells them what their purpose is: to rule, fill, and subdue creation, right? To rule over creation, radah. And this is a word that I think is to to bring order and harmony, a sense of, to bring order from chaos. Radah, malay, to fill, to make things, to create culture. And then kabosh, we have that expression, to put the kabosh on it. But this is the Hebrew word that gets translated as subdue. And it really has to do with kind of conquering the chaos of the world. And so human beings are made to image God as we rule, fill, and subdue. You can kind of bundle those three together in the way that I like to talk about it is partnering with God for the flourishing of his creation, both other image bearers and the world around us. Well, this is the basis for a theology of work. We are created to rule, fill, and subdue. We are created to partner with God for the flourishing of his creation. So then we start thinking about our respective jobs and say, okay, how do I approach my work as my unique way of partnering with God in the flourishing of his creation? And I think all kinds of jobs that can have that sort of theological understanding. You think about a school teacher who, in teaching children to read, that person is partnering with God for the flourishing of those kids and our world because they're learning to read. Or, a stay-at-home parent who's teaching a child to be patient, to be kind. Well, there's a sense in which that work with that child is partnering with God for the flourishing of that child, but also of society, because forming virtue in a little kid. And you can expand that out to, all kinds of work. I think about the barista who made the coffee that I'm drinking, right? Just my having caffeine flowing in my veins to be semi-coherent this morning that's partnering with God for the flourishing of me and our podcast and all the people that are listening to us. And so to just have that lens to think about the work that I do, in what way am I partnering with God for the flourishing of his creation, that I'm exercising what it means to image God by ruling and filling and subduing creation. So it's right there from the very beginning of the biblical story. And we'll probably get into this a little bit more. It flows all the way out to the very end of the biblical story.
Yeah. Yeah. Jesus' invitation to discipleship is to be with him so as to become like him and then to carry on his work in the world. We talk a lot about that here at IBC. It's to join God on his mission in the world. And that means much more than what we do on a Sunday or even opportunities that we have to share the gospel. Joining God on his mission in the world is to participate in that is all of life, which includes our work. And so our work today is this sort of future glimpse into this Jesus will return one day, and he's going to restore all that is broken. He's going to heal our fractured world. But today, as we work, that is a future glimpse of that healed world that is to come when Jesus returns. And like you said, work is on the very first page of the scriptures. It's at the start of the story, but it's not just work. It's seeing God as a worker. And just like you said, Barry, that is one of the ways we image God is through our work. It's how we evidence our dignity through our work. And there's so many pieces in that creation story. The creation story of the Bible is totally unique when you look at the other ancient origin stories. So most of the ancient origin stories have some kind of battle scene where it's these cosmic forces warring against one another. But that's not what you see in the biblical story. In the biblical story, it's this God who creates, that his act of creation is his work, that there's not this battlefield scene. Instead, it's like this picture of God as a craftsman or God as
bringing order out of chaos.
Yes, order out of chaos, ruling. And that is what we get invited to be part of. Because while, that idea of rule, fill, and subdue, while everything God created was good, there's still all this untapped potential. That now we, as image bearers of God, get to almost unlock through our work. So that we create and we cultivate and we partner with God in that ongoing creation activity that is our work, whatever that looks like.
And I imagine some people who might be scratching their head at this point and kind of going, okay, but how does my work reflect partnering with God for the flourishing of His, like, okay, we can think about these, particular examples, but, I work in an office building and a cubicle, and it sort of feels like my work is just about, making money for my company. And yet I think there's even a way to think about, what does it mean to partner with God for the flourishing of your coworkers?
Yeah.
Right. So this business that you're a part of is contributing to the livelihoods of all the people who are a part of it. And so I have the opportunity to contribute my part in partnering with God for the flourishing of my company, of my coworkers, my bosses, my employees. And so I just think if we could really have that kind of lens to approach whatever task it is that we're up to, it totally changes and really gets rid of that sort of sacred secular divide, that there's holy things, there's sacred things that are kind of the things we do in church, right, or the things that we do. In other words, the way I heard it one time is oftentimes preachers talk a lot about, spend most of their time talking about what people do with the least of their time. When in fact, the Bible has a lot to say about what people spend most of their time doing, which is their work.
How do we keep work from becoming an idol?
Yeah, I think what often happens, the human tendency is to find our identity. We're looking for acceptance in all these other places. And so oftentimes that becomes our work, whether that means if I'm successful enough, if I'm powerful enough, if I make enough money, if I get this promotion, then finally I'll be somebody. And so we kind of create our own self-salvation projects, and you can do that in lots of different ways. And yet what the gospel invites us into is to say the pressure's off. You don't have to give in to this relentless pressure of trying to secure your worth or your identity through your work. Work is part of leading a meaningful and purposeful life, but it's not all that there is to life. To lead a meaningful life means that you're going to work in some way, whether that's paid or unpaid, and yet work is not the meaning of life. And it's understanding who you are, your identity in Christ as this is who I am, and because of this, I see work as a gift from God, that this is something good that God has given me. Oftentimes when we even think about the Genesis story, we see work is part of paradise, that it wasn't a result of the fall. And I think that's really important to note because like you said, work is often, it can often be frustrating and hard, and that is a result of the fall, but work itself is not a result of the fall.
I think that order is so important because I feel like sometimes that gets kind of jumbled up whenever you're young. You hear that it's like, oh, that's the result of the fall is now you got to work hard. And it came before that.
It came before that.
So anyway.
Because it's a basic human need that it is part of what gives us meaning and purpose, but it's not the meaning of our lives. And I think we get that kind of twisted oftentimes, and it's coming back to who am I? Where is my identity? My worth is found in what Jesus has already done for me. I'm accepted, I'm secure, and not so therefore I don't need to look for that. And so I can see work as a gift. I can see work as an act of service where the purpose of my work is to serve God and to serve others. Or I can see work as an act of love, that I honor God and I love my neighbor through my work. And I can see work as an act of worship, that we're called to do our work well, that if you're called to work 8 hours, you don't cut corners and work 6, that's part of what Paul talks about in Colossians 3 says, whatever you do, work as for the Lord and not for your human masters. And so it's this idea of that I'm going to do my work well, I'm going to do my work with excellence, and that is how I'm offering my work to God as this act of worship. So I think if we can think about it in that way, then work doesn't become an idol for us.
Yeah, I think my mind, when you asked the question, went back to the words from John Calvin, who talks about the idea that the human heart is a perpetual idol-making factory. Right? We are constantly creating idols when we take a good thing and turn it into an ultimate thing. Right? And we do that with all sorts of things. And yet I think work is one of those things that is very unique in its capacity for us to do that with. It is a good thing, part of why we're created, to partner with God for the flourishing of his creation. And yet we turn it into an ultimate thing so that we look to our work to provide us a sense of identity and security. and that's when it gets twisted. And so we talk about, you use the language of worship, and we talk about living lives of worship unto God, and yet we can live in such a way that sort of indicates the way in which we're worshiping our work, looking to it to give us that sense of satisfaction, identity, and security. And so it's coming back to rooting our sense of identity and security in Christ, in our relationship with God, that allows us then to not need work to provide us that sense of identity and security, but rather we can approach it with that sense of, this is what I'm called to. And so rather than worship my work, I can do my work as an act of worship. Yeah. Whatever you do, do your work heartily as unto the Lord. This is what it means to work in a way that is an act of worship.
Well, I was going to say, and you see that again in the Genesis story where God rests after his work. And I think that's a really good example for us to say, this is why we talk a lot about Sabbath as a discipline and as a rhythm in our lives, because it's this day, that this period of time that we say, I am not what I produce. I am not what my work is, that there is a God and I am not him. And it's a recognition, this weekly rhythm to understand who is God and who am I, and where is my identity rooted in.
That's good.
Yeah, you might have answered this, but I was thinking, what would you say is the biggest difference between what our world wants of work and what Scripture and God wants of work?
I think oftentimes where the world tells us to think about our work as what's going to make me the most money, right? And what God is calling us to work, the purpose of work is to serve God and to serve others, to love God and to love others. If that's true, then the question I should be asking is, how does my work benefit others? So there may be times where God is calling you to take a lesser paying job that is going to benefit people in a greater way. I'm not saying that's what everyone can do or should do. I'm just saying that's the way we need to think about our work. And again, I think if we do that, it really changes the way we consider the role of work in our lives. Because to your point, I mean, because of the fall, Genesis 3 tells us that there will be painful toil and thorns and thistles. And so work can be hard and it can be frustrating and sometimes it can feel pointless. But if we can think about our work as an act of worship, as this offering to God, as our way of serving God and serving others, then that changes our whole perspective. And I think the world calls us to look at ourselves, where God invites us to think of others and to serve others through our work.
That's good. I think about what often kind of comes with, especially the further you get in your career, I think sometimes the greater the tendency to sacrifice other things for the sake of your career.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not even the further you get, because in some ways it's even as you're trying to get started in your career, there can be this temptation to sacrifice other things for the sake of advancing in your career. And so I think when we have this sort of theology of work, it helps us to be mindful that in itself is a form of sort of worshiping our work, right? When we're sacrificing, for example, our family or our health. And there have been times in my own work as a pastor where I can easily get pulled into sacrificing my family, sacrificing my health. I give the best of myself to my work, and I have very little left to give to my wife, to my kids, to my friends. And so I think that just thinking of work as worship is an opportunity for us to reevaluate. Yes, we give deeply, right? We work hard. We pour ourselves into our work, but we're careful to guard in such a way that we're not sacrificing other good things, important things, meaningful things in our lives for the sake of our work.
Jesus could have just hung out in the temple and taught all day, but he didn't. He actually worked too. So why does that matter to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is what we've talked about a number of times on the podcast of when we think of Jesus as the fully God and fully human, that Jesus shows us what the fully human life looks like. So there's something I think profoundly meaningful about the fact that he is someone who the Greek word that's used there, we sometimes think of carpenters, tekton. He's a person who a laborer who worked with his hands. And so Jesus worked, and he shows us what that fully human life looks like, even as we think about the sort of engaging in manual labor.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say exactly what you're saying there. To lead a meaningful life includes work, and that's what Jesus shows us. That, I imagine Jesus has calluses on his hands from working with his hands all day, and that's what he did for however many years before he went into ministry. And what an example that is to us, that Jesus says, whatever you do, right, whatever he did, he worked hard at, and I'm sure that he made some really good furniture or whatever it was.
And I think it's also worth noting that he was continuing to work when he entered ministry, right? I think about that one scene in Mark's gospel where he has sent out the disciples on their little short-term mission trip, and then they come back and they're beginning to sort of share stories about what happened. And people are just flocking to them for ministry. And it talks about the idea that there were so many that were coming to them that they didn't even have time to eat. And I just always think about that story because I'm like, I've been there, right? I've been so sort of caught up in the demands of ministry that just the opportunity to stop and eat. And that's the point at which Jesus says to the disciples, let's go away and let's get some rest. Interestingly enough, they go away to get the rest, and that's when the crowd shows up and he does the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. So Jesus is both in his pre-ministry manual labor showing us what it means to live a fully human life of work, but then also even in his work of ministry, he is giving himself away for the glory of God and the good of other people. And to me, that's at the heart of it, right? Giving myself away, investing myself, my life, for the glory of God and for the good of other people.
Yeah, and I think that leads me to think about, oftentimes we think about work as this sort of sacred, secular divide where those that are in vocational ministry, that's a higher calling. And I just think that's totally wrong. That is nothing that the Bible talks about. Before I became a pastor and went into vocational ministry, I worked for 15 years in corporate finance. And my work in corporate finance was an act of worship to God. In very different ways of what I do now, and yet it was equally this offering to God every day to say, I'm going to do my work to the best of my ability. I'm going to try to love others well. I'm going to use my work as a way to serve others. And that really helped me make different decisions. And I think if I didn't have that perspective, I would have otherwise. And so I think we need to dispel the notion that there's this difference between well, you're a pastor. Of course your work is an act of worship. No, your work is an act of worship if you're a teacher or a stay-at-home mom or, a cashier at Kroger, whatever it is. Your work can be an act of worship. Your calling is, if you could see your work as, I've got this assignment from God, and I'm going to, that means I'm going to do my best to serve God by doing my best in my work. Because that's my calling, to serve God and to serve others.
That's good.
I have a couple one-off questions about work and labor. Where does tithing come into the purpose of work?
Tithing and work. It's a good question.
Or does
I'm
it?
not sure.
I don't know.
Thought about it.
I
Connecting those two together.
Yeah, I haven't necessarily connected those two together.
Yeah.
I think, you're asking that question because typically when we think of work, it's paid work, and then what do you do with your finances?
Yeah.
Like we just said, all of life is meant to be under the rule and reign of God, and so therefore how we use our money is also from God. We're stewards of those resources, just like our time and our work. We're stewards of those resources and how we use our finances as well.
Yeah.
Maybe another day we could do a little deeper dive. I don't want to get too in the weeds with regard to tithing. It's a principle that we see in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant people of God, the expectation of giving a tenth. We actually don't see that same principle reiterated in the New Testament, but I don't think it's because it's not a meaningful, helpful principle. It in some sense, what you see in the New Testament, the New Covenant people of God, is this posture of open-handed generosity in response to grace
Yeah.
that isn't about a particular percentage.
Right.
For some, it's actually even to go beyond a particular percentage. But I think, again, it's about recognizing that we are ultimately stewards of all that God has given us. He has given us this work to steward. He's given us the financial resources to steward. And so part of what it means for us to steward well what God has entrusted to us is actually recognizing the responsibility then to give back to the work that God is doing through the local church. So this is part of what kind of the principle of the tithe is all about, is the ways in which we invest resources that God has entrusted to us, investing in the work of God through the local church, giving generously to other organizations, other efforts that are intended to try to help people that are in need, and so that we would recognize all that we are and all that we have is entrusted to us for the sake of God's glory and the good of other people.
Will we work in heaven?
I told Barry he had answered this question. I learned this from him.
Yeah, this is a great question. So there's a couple of aspects, I think, of that. One is what you see when you get to the end of the biblical story. So we spent a lot of time talking about Genesis 1, 2, Genesis 3, the fall. But when you come to the end of the biblical story, Revelation 21 and 22, this picture of the renewal of all things. And we talk a lot about around here this idea that there's coming a day when everything wrong with this world will be made right. Everything broken in this world will be made whole. Everything marred in this world will be made beautiful. And you see this image of the new Jerusalem, the dwelling place of God coming down out of heaven. The one who's seated on the throne says, I'm making everything new. So the kingdom of God has come in its fullness. And one of the things that you see in this depiction of the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven is this image of the kings of the earth bringing their riches into the city of God. And you see this, if you look back in the Psalms, you see it in the book of Isaiah, this image of the nations bringing their glory, bringing their goodness before God in this sort of future of the kingdom of God coming in its fullness. And so it's this idea that the work that we do now matters even on into eternity, right? It's this idea of like, do your work in such a way as though it will last. Because I think what you see in the biblical story is there is work that we do now, right? We sometimes think of this really strong sense of discontinuity between the world as we know it and the world that is to come. And yet the Bible paints a more complex picture, certainly of a purgation of the world as we know it, but not in such a way that all is done, that the riches of human culture come into the new heavens and new earth. And then what you see at the end of Revelation 22, so you get this beautiful depiction of the new heavens, new earth, this renewed material creation. And the throne of God is there in the midst of this renewed material creation. And the very last lines before you get kind of the epilogue in the final verses, the very last descriptive lines of this closing scene say, and they will reign. Right? This idea that they will reign forever and ever. And it's ambiguous who the they is that is being referred to. Is this the one who's seated on the throne and the Lamb? Or is this the people? And I think that ambiguity is actually very intentional, because I think what you see at the end of the biblical story is the same thing you see at the beginning of the story. And that is people who are made in the image of God, ruling and reigning with him forever. And ruling and reigning isn't about, just sitting on a throne, and right. It is about bringing order to the chaos. It is about seeing the flourishing of the realm over which you reign. And so the picture that we have of what forever looks like is that we are still partnering with God for the flourishing of his creation. We will reign with him forever.
I think oftentimes when people ask that question is because we think of work with these negative connotations of like, oh, really? We're
Am I going to work the merch shop in heaven?
Like, doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun, right? But the first time I heard Barry teach on this, I was really blown away at like, that is the picture of a healed, restored world, isn't it? That God invites us now to participate in this ongoing creative activity that we will see in eternity as well. And it's not going to be drudgery. It's going to be restful, and it's going to be rewarding and refreshing. God redeems work as he's redeeming all of creation, and that's what we're going to see in the world to come.
I feel like that's a great spot to end. Something I want to put in the description is maybe we can touch base on these later. Just a couple of verses or passages that people listening to this can go back to, that they can put it on a sticky note at their work, and it's some encouragement of how they can view their job right now or the day-to-day grind of that.
And I would just add, and maybe we can add links, but a couple of books that are particularly helpful in this regard. Culture Making from Andy Crouch is a fantastic book that really talks about our human calling to make and cultivate culture, and uses the big biblical story to do this. And so the class that Sissy made reference to was required to read that Culture Making from Andy Crouch. Every Good Endeavor from Tim Keller is a book that is on the theology of work, and it's fantastic. And then one that I especially love, and John Mark Comer, who I think really has spoken really powerfully to the millennial generation and even younger Gen Z. His book, Garden City, lays this out in really clear and compelling kinds of ways. It's probably the most accessible read of those three, but it's really it's both accessible and profound all at the same time. It's really, really good. Garden City.
Garden City.
Yeah, those are great recommendations.
All right. At the end of each podcast, we have a banter moment.
We do.
And we have some fun. We have a few minutes here. And the question for this week, since we're talking about work, is we got to talk about either your worst job or your first job. Or I guess they could be both.
They could be. I'm not sure mine's as good as yours, but my first job was, I think I was a sophomore or maybe even a freshman in high school. And you're not going to believe this, but first I was the cashier at the store called Rickles, which was basically like a small Home Depot. I don't even think Home Depot really existed then.
You worked at a hardware store.
I worked at a hardware store. But not only was I a cashier, I then decided I was going to get I could do what other people were doing, and I became the sales associate for lumber.
All right.
So I needed to know everything about lumber.
What in the world?
That was my first job, which was really interesting. So that would be like first and probably worst.
That's hilarious.
Sent you down a career path.
It did. I quickly realized that is not my calling.
So I was trying to remember my early jobs and what order they came in. So I worked for the city of Grapevine for a while with their Parks and Recreation department, like as a scorekeeper for softball games and volleyball games. And so I would sit there and watch, adult league sports and keep score, and got paid for that. Yeah. I went on to work for them in the Parks and Rec department, and just remembered that we had this, I don't even remember what the facility was, but it was this big facility, and they had this sprinkler system. And I'll just never forget, the sprinkler system was apparently the water from it was actually came from the sewage system. And I'm out there in the middle of this field doing something, and suddenly the sprinklers come on, and the water. So that was a pretty rough job. Yeah. I didn't stick with that one for very long after that part of it. But I also then early on worked for a family member who they had a property management company within this kind of real estate. So they had these rental properties. And basically my job, I had several different responsibilities, but one of the primary ones was when we had to evict people. I was the one who had to go to the door and put the eviction notice on people's door. So that was a miserable experience for a 17-year-old, 18-year-old kid.
And your personality, you're 9.
Exactly. Exactly.
You're
so
like taping it up and running.
Definitely hoping that I could just tape it to the door and didn't actually have to hand it to anybody. So, but then I think Sissy was making reference a minute ago to the story I told earlier. My most random job was when I spent one semester as a high school math teacher. And the irony of that, because I was like a C math student when I was in school, but Kim, we had just gotten married, and she was working at this little private Christian school and teaching in elementary, and they had a math teacher who left in the middle of the year, and they were looking for somebody. Well, I had done youth ministry, so I'd worked with teenagers, and yeah, they gave me the job, and so I would spend the night before like studying, trying to relearn high school algebra so that I could turn around and teach it the next day. Now, part of what's interesting is the woman
part of it.
Yeah,
this whole thing is interesting.
Yeah.
But the woman who taught the first semester had a master's degree in mathematics, but I think didn't really get teenagers. And so all these kids were really struggling with math. Well, I didn't know math hardly at all, but I knew teenagers, and I was a communicator. And so I came in and approached it very differently in terms of teaching them, and their grades really turned around that second semester. and I was like also sort of doing the youth pastor thing, so I was real involved in kind of what was going on in the lives of these kids, and it was really a ton of fun. But I'm glad it was only one semester, because I don't know how Barry, the math teacher, would be sustainable.
This shows us you could probably teach anything. Like, your teaching math is like my favorite job that you had.
There's a whole like class of students that just really struggle.
We don't know pre-calc, but
that next grade, their teachers are like, "Who taught you math?"
No, they got it. They got it.
But they loved him.
Yes, they loved you. My first job was at a golf course, and I was like mowing the greens, so I had to wake up at like 5 in the morning.
Gosh.
So some of my nights of mowing it, I would just stay up all night playing Xbox with my friends. And I'm like, all right, guys, last game of COD. I'm going into work and mow the greens.
Mow the greens.
There's nothing more, man. You mess up a pin location on a green, and you have all the
that's a lot of pressure.
All the vets coming after you.
Yep.
Also worked in retail a long time, so. There's nothing more that makes you lose your faith in humanity
Than retail.
Yeah. And so my heart goes out to everybody working in retail and all of that.
Yeah, that is a tough job.
All right. It's another week of Formed. We'll be back next week, next Thursday, with another episode.